This is the principal's office.
Everybody had to report back.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We are back, huh?
They made me do it, first of all.
Sounds like you've been there a few times.
Thanks, Adam, for bringing us back. We have very little time left, but I did want to hear from some of you what your feelings were about the exercise, whether there was more to talk about, and so on. Let's see. Why don't we just self-select from the groups? Any one of the groups want to report back in? Christine, were you in the Bodic group?
Yeah.
And who else was in your group?
We had a large group of us, actually. I can't, so there were quite a few of us there, quite a few people who are authors of the articles that were in the folder. So, I think we all have kind of complicated feelings about some of the issues that you're raising, and complicated feelings about what to do about it, if anything. But we all recognize the need to come up with a system that one could teach native speakers to work with if they are to begin transcribing texts, right? So there's got to be something they can do. I think it's hard because, using me for an example, my interlinearization system is partially determined by the audience I'm presenting materials for. I've always had to, I've always been writing academic papers in journals or in edited books in which my interlinearization and glossing is there because I'm using that example to try to demonstrate an analysis I'm making, right? So, but at the same time, I do have contradictions. So, even in my own work. And one of the ways we kind of saw this in Bodish was, for example, clause chaining and converbal constructions. Like, that's one example. Another way we saw this coming out was in some of the articles on Tibetan, depending on how much you want to acknowledge the kind of beautiful and complicated diachrony of Tibetan, your interlinearization will either kind of reflect that or not in different ways. So we didn't really have enough time to flesh that out more. We just kind of observed what we saw and then kind of talked about it. And so anybody else in the group, if you feel like following up on my garbled attempt at summarizing.
Well, I thought that was a good overview. Since we don't have a lot of time, we may just skip to another subgroup. And we definitely want to follow up with you. And what we are going to be doing is we're going to be writing to you to see if you feel like talking about this more and actually providing us with some good examples, because we just took what we had in our box of PDFs, but you will have much better examples of what we can use. Cookie Chin people, did you want to say anything?
I can just quickly summarize. We talked about verb stem alternation, which is something that is hard to, tell, and there's lots of different ways that people have dealt with that. But let's see. We were just saying, if it's not marked, did they forget, or did they choose not to mark it, or what does it mean if it's not marked? So we talked about that for a little bit, and also the different sorts of scripts that you're using will kind of impact also what is the end result of the IGT. And then, where to put the dashes, or will you put dashes? These sorts of things.
Okay, great. Yeah. Maybe I'll turn to Alexis, since Alexis would have a slightly different perspective. Or Alexis, which group were you in?
So I was in other languages of Manipur. We had quite a small group, and we really relied heavily on Patricia to talk to us about, she was really our only Tibeto-Burmanist. So we heard a lot, we got to hear a lot about some of the issues that she's dealing with and some of the decisions she's trying to make as she's, getting to know the language that she's working on. We talked quite a bit too about, the sort of, first, the value of at those early stages of sort of over specifying. So Trisha talked about, when she's not quite sure yet what's going on, this sort of the separating things out, splitting instead of lumping, so that you can later go back and decide whether whether these different occurrences of a morpheme, for example, are doing the same thing or doing different things, and how to handle all of that. And we also talked some about, the sort of idea of comparison, the many reasons that trying to impose standards is a bad idea. And the importance of thinking instead about, maybe if you want to do comparison, about mapping between different sort of ways of glossing rather than trying to impose one way of glossing.
Right. So, well, that's been an idea. Just add another tier and then try to get, one person labels one thing one way, another one another, but they're really meaning the same thing, or they're both in the tense aspect arena. So we just, we could then have like a super category that grabs both of those and just says, this is what that really means, or this is the standardized form. And I guess one of the problems is that we haven't really even had a chance right now to talk about how we are, which part of a morpheme or a construction we are putting in our annotation and which parts we're not. So we had this great paper on Vaipei where there was a detailed semantic explanation of one of the morphemes, showing that there were so many different ways in which it could be glossed, depending on which part is being focused on. And that was, I guess that has to do with this polysemy issue and construction issue. But we haven't had I guess that's going to take a long time to go through and see, can we map? How easy is it to map? And is it just that simple that, oh, we don't need to standardize, we can just have the second line and map? So I guess we'd want to try it out, see how well that would work. Or if there had to be further discussion on what we're annotating. Yeah. Any other groups? What were some of the other groups I've forgotten what they were?
Lolo-Burmese.
Any of the Lolo-Burmese team want to weigh in? I'm assuming Jim and
Randy, I think you can best summarize what we did.
I ended up talking too much. But we kind of got into other issues, more general issues of how to do, how to reflect what I was trying to argue for is how to reflect the constructionalist nature of language, rather than looking at these individual morphemes as if they exist with a particular meaning and use in some abstract world. And one of the points I was trying to make, we actually didn't talk that much about concrete issues, except some other things in terms of specific glossing. But the issue that I was trying to point out was that in typology, there is a clear distinction made between language descriptive categories, or this categories that you use in describing an individual language, and categories that we use for comparison, that they're not the same thing. That the ones we use for comparison are comparative concepts. They're not categories, but they're abstract concepts. And the debates, we've had some pretty heated debates in typology, on the link type list and in the journal Linguistic Typology, about how abstract those categories can be. And so I argued in particular with Martin Hasselmath and Matthew Dreyer, because they like to have very, very abstract concepts where they can lump a lot of languages together, or categories of different languages together, as if they're the so-called same thing. And they're not really the same thing. There is no such thing as commensurate categories between languages. If we're working empirically. And I think we still really need to kind of get out of our 1970s, 80s kind of assumption of universal categories and things like that, and which drives a lot of stuff still today, and start working more on an empirical basis of looking at each language as a unique system and reflecting. The reason why we document these languages is because they reflect a unique worldview. That's what makes them worth all the effort that we put into them. And so we don't want to just assume a bunch of universal categories and apply them to the languages. We want to do like what Jim did and treat the language on its own and give it its own categories. Now, when you do a comparison, you use these things like the Leipzig glossing. The Leipzig glossing was made by Haspelmath and those other people for typology, which means they represent not language-specific categories, but comparative concepts. And so you might have two different tiers. You might have a tier for your language-specific categories, and then if you can associate that with some comparative concept, you might associate it. You might do that. You have a separate tier of those categories, those kind of more those not categories, those concepts. And so then when people the reason why they set those Leipzig things is because these people like Haspelmath and Dreyer, they want to be able to just skim through a bunch of grammars and pick out all of that things that they think are commensurate. Not commensurate, I shouldn't say that they're comparable in the sense of comparative concepts. They're not the same categories, and Martin and Matthew also recognize that they're not the same categories, but they are comparable. And so that might be one way around this problem. In terms of what Alexis was talking about, it's also an issue. We didn't talk about this in the Lolo Burmese group, but it's also an issue as to whether you are approaching this from the point of view of the cognitive categories of the speakers or the cognitive categories of the linguists. Because if you're marking the morpheme, the use of the morpheme as it's used in each context differently, you are reflecting your analysis of it. And also one should remember in doing linguistic analysis, all of our analyses are made up. They're not real in the language. There are heuristics for trying to understand how the language works. They're not real. Keep that in mind. But then, so the other option is to try to understand the cognitive category of the speakers. What distinctions do the speakers make? Do they understand the difference between the use of zai or like say, for example, we're talking about how is zai a preposition or a verb? You know, do native speakers make a distinction between those two? And so what I often tend to mark the same morpheme the same way, because I don't see any evidence that the native speakers make a distinction. Sorry, I'm talking too much again.
Well,
My wife says that I never have a short answer to anything.
I think maybe, Ken, were you about to say something?
No, I was just moving.
Oh, you were just moving.
If I may just add something very briefly.
Yeah, please.
I think my generation, those of us who are maybe writing a first ever sketch grammar or grammar, we are more convinced of, you know, all of the scientific evidence for the specificity, linguistic, cultural, evolutionary, or otherwise. And we're less concerned with those old debates, but we really sometimes puzzle about how much performance detail, how much sociolinguistic detail, how much constructional detail to build into transcription and glossing. And you know, you really want to be faithful to what's empirically happening, but you also want to be useful to your audience. And it's really hard. There's no single guideline for how to achieve this. And sometimes one feels a little lost. That's just a subjective reflection there.
That's very useful. Thank you. Yeah.
But that assumes a distinction between performance and competence, which I don't necessarily make. Sorry.
It's the guidelines part that I was focusing on. But yeah. Any other reflections from your groups? Yeah, Samson, I'm putting you on this. Which group did you go to?
I went to the South Central group.
Oh, you're in the South Central too.
Yeah.
Okay. We were in the Borogaro group, but we found we just did not have enough information to make any, you know, suggestions or observations. We had two. We could make this observation. We had two people who were working in very different traditions, and also the third piece was from the 1970s, and compared across these three, you saw very different styles of annotation. So that actually very well illustrates the kind of issue that we're talking about here. It's just did not have to do with philosophies of how language work or how they should be described. It just was different traditions and different time periods when they were working. Jim, did you have any, you actually could have the final word if you had a final word to.
I don't have a final word.
You don't have a final word. I may have to take that. Nancy Kaplow, anything? No.
No, not really, but I appreciated the comment that Randy made that our analyses are made up and they're not really what happens in the language. And I often think that, so it was very nice to hear.
Well, let's say linguistics is an art as well as a science. And it takes a certain flair to do justice to a language by putting it in its full context. And, you know, some people take a too mechanistic approach, I guess.
I think that was
Jim.
that's a great final word. Great.
Yeah.
It's an art and not a science. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for playing this, for doing this exercise. I really appreciate it. And we will we will follow up with some sort of write-up for you to do what you will with, and hopefully you will respond to it when we send that to you. So take a break, and